I believe Republicans want that. I believe at least Christians that I know, every Republican Christian I know wants those things. Democrats want those things. Independents want those things. This is not a matter of party or politics. It's a matter of being human. We've heard a lot about common sense in government today. I think that's just so important. We need common sense. We also need common decency, and we need common justice, and we need common righteousness to be part of the values of our country. That too is what makes America great. To the degree that you fail to do these things, that you didn't really give a damn about the people who were vulnerable or hurting, then you fail to do it for me. So these are challenges for us as individuals. They're challenges for us as communities, as churches, as communities, and also as a nation. Welcome to the Making Sense of Faith podcast. On this podcast, we seek to make sense of faith, the questions of faith, and also questions of how we live out our faith in the world. My name is Adam Hamilton. I'm the host of this podcast. I'm a pastor and an author of a few books, and I'm really glad you're joining us today. Today, I want to talk about two Hebrew words. These are words that show up 357 times in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. The words are mishpat and sedaka. And they can be pronounced differently, and my Hebrew's a little rusty, so maybe if you're somebody who knows Hebrew well, you might say them a bit differently. But mishpat and tzedekah are two really important words in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that describe both who God is and what God expects of us as human beings. And so I thought we'd talk a little bit about those today. So the word mishpat, it shows up 200 plus times in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and it means, it's often translated as justice. It has to do with fairness and with a particular focus on people who may not have access to fairness. So this is in the courts, people who had wealth, resources, people who were influential in society might be, there might be a temptation to treat them differently in the courts than people who were homeless or people who were poor or people who were, had no, financial means or were just people who were powerless. And so there was a great concern in the Hebrew Bible. One of the beautiful things about the Old Testament was a concern that the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized, the powerless have justice, that they're treated fairly, equitably in the society. And so this is in the courts. It's in how we interact with one another, this idea of justice. And in particular, there were often several categories of people that were mentioned. Among them, widows were mentioned because they were powerless. Orphans were mentioned, and the poor. And sometimes immigrants or people who were strangers in the land were also mentioned in that connection. And the scriptures called people to practice justice, not just as individuals, but as a society. And so when justice wasn't practiced, then God promised, retribution upon the people. God promised that he would not protect them and that bad things would happen if they were not practicing justice. The other word is tzedekah. And tzedekah is often translated as righteousness, but it is sometimes, at least within the Jewish faith today, tzedekah, there are tzedekah boxes, which is where you put money to give to the poor. And so tzedekah is often seen as charity. But it's literally helping people. It's doing the right thing, and the right thing had to do with helping the vulnerable, the poor, those who were in need. So you can see these two things go hand in hand in the scripture. As we seek to love God and love our neighbor, the two great commandments in the Bible, these ideas of mishpat and sedaka are just essential. So you can't love your neighbor if you're not practicing mishpat and sedaka. And when I think of these words, the failure to practice them, again, would be the downfall of the two nations that made up God's people, Israel and Judah. They would, again and again, we find God saying through the prophets, okay, I have these things against you. And among those things, God was concerned when they worshiped the other gods, so when they practiced idolatry. But the other one was injustice, when they didn't practice justice or righteousness. So in Isaiah chapter 58, this is an interesting passage, and it's characteristic, or it's similar to many others, but it's sort of an elongated or it goes into more depth than some of the other passages do. But I want you to listen to this. So Isaiah chapter 58, shout it aloud, do not hold back. And by the way, this is talks about fasting, and so we're in the season of Lent right now when I'm filming this, and in the season of Lent we fast from certain things. And so shout it aloud, do not hold back, raise your voice like a trumpet, declare to my people their rebellion, and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. So this is God speaking. Day after day, they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. So these are people who thought they were religious. They talked a big religious talk, and they were willing to, talk about their faith and fast. And he says, they ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. So they pray. They seem like they want to be close to God. And then God says this, why have we fasted? Well, he's quoting the people. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? So they're like, how come, God, you're not blessing us when we're trying to, seek you and do your will? But then this is what God says in response. Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please, and you exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen, only a day for people to humble themselves? Or I might say, is this the kind of fast God has chosen just to give up Diet Coke or chocolates for 40 days leading up to Good Friday and Easter? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed or lying in sackcloth and ashes? And of course, we began the season of Lent on Ash Wednesday with ashes on our foreheads. Is this what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fast I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice, untie the cords of the yoke, and to set the oppressed free, to break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry, and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? And when you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. And then I want you to listen to these promises. So what God is looking for, he says here, is justice, it's righteousness, it's being concerned with the poor, the vulnerable, the weak. Then he says this, then if you do these things, your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will come quickly. And then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing of fingers and malicious talk, and if you spend yourself on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. What beautiful promises that are found there in the scripture. So I think about this, and today, over the last few months, we have been, we've seen in our country a huge emphasis on cutting waste in government, which I think is a good thing. Nobody wants waste in government. We've talked about, policies and procedures, things that are happening in government that maybe we're allowed to creep in that shouldn't be there. So, I've watched this, what's happening in our nation, and I'm like, good, that's great. Let's make sure that we are being, we are using tax money wisely, that if there are things that are inconsistent with our values as a country, we weed those out. Maybe we've allowed things to come in that are ridiculous and that we shouldn't be funding. So I'm all for that. And I want you to hear that. Republicans or Democrats or independents, I'm all for, let's be really good with our money when it comes to our tax money and our resources. But part of what I fear is that we've taken a chainsaw, and that's actually been a metaphor. I remember seeing Elon Musk with a chainsaw at CPAC or one of the other events. But I fear that we've taken a chainsaw when we needed a scalpel to be able to look and see what in these government programs, what in these in the allocation of resources that are our tax monies, what is waste and what is needful to help people who are vulnerable. What is needful to be able to make sure that mishpat and sedaka are practiced in the world around us? These are things that, of course, synagogues and churches are meant to practice. Individual Christians are meant to practice. But governments are meant to do the same. So in the Hebrew Bible, we find God is expecting the mechanisms of government to ensure that these things are happening. And I think we need to be doing the same. So I want to simply encourage us. We read in Proverbs 31:8-9 these words, and I just want to encourage us to think about these. Speak out on behalf of the voiceless, and for all the rights of those who are vulnerable. Speak out in order to judge with righteousness and to defend the needy and the poor. Or I think about how Amos says, let justice roll down like a river and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Justice and righteousness, equity and fairness, and compassion and mercy towards people who are in need. Let's make sure that what we're doing as a government and as a nation is still being concerned for the vulnerable and the weak, and that we are looking to create safety nets that are protecting people and not simply with a chainsaw hacking everything off and realizing in the end that we failed to practice mishpat and sedaka. I believe Republicans want that. I believe at least Christians that I know, every Republican Christian I know wants those things. Democrats want those things. Independents want those things. This is not a matter of party or politics. It's a matter of being human. And I think about, we've heard a lot about common sense in government today. I think that's just so important. We need common sense. We also need common decency. And we need common justice. And we need common righteousness to be part of the values of our country. That, too, is what makes America great. So I'm reminded of Jesus' words in the Gospels. He picks up these same themes. And in the parable of the sheep and the goats, he says at the last day, the last judgment's going to go down like this. I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was sick and in prison, you visited me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And as much as you did it for one of the least of these, you did it for me. And he's describing the final judgment. I mean, we're going to be held accountable for this. And if to the degree that you failed to do these things, that you didn't really give a damn about the people who were vulnerable or hurting, then you failed to do it for me. So these are challenges for us as individuals. They're challenges for us as communities, as churches, as communities, and also as a nation. And then finally, of course, Jesus talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And when he spoke about the Good Samaritan, he was giving a picture of what does it mean to love your neighbor. And to love your neighbor was when you saw somebody who was in need of health care, somebody who was in need of a place to stay, somebody who was in need in food, drink, shelter, that you provided those things to them. And to the degree that we did that, we were the neighbor who loved our neighbor. All right. So just these are things that are on my mind as I'm thinking about how do we live out our faith in the world? How do we make sense of living out our faith in this world? And I believe you can be a Republican or a Democrat, you can be an independent, and you can say, let's do everything we can to create a very effective and frugal government. And let's not forget the vulnerable and the weak and those who are in need. And I think that's a place for you, whether you're a Trump supporter or not a Trump supporter. It's a place for us to be able to say in our conversations, I'm all for saving money. I'm all for doing these things. But I also think it's really important that we not forget the poor, the vulnerable, and those who are in need. Hey, thanks for joining me today. I hope you'll join me next week for our next podcast as we continue to make sense of faith.
Thanks for tuning in to Making Sense of Faith with Adam Hamilton. Do you know someone wrestling with life's biggest questions? Share this episode with them, because the more people willing to embrace the hard questions, the better. Do you want to go deeper? You can visit makingsenseoffaith.com to find the show notes and additional resources. That's also where you can sign up to get the notes and resources delivered straight to your inbox. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe and leave us a rating in your podcast player. That'll make sure that you get the latest episodes and help others find the podcast. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit that notification bell to catch future episodes and videos there. Until next time, remember that your questions matter. Doubts are normal, and making sense of faith is a lifelong journey. We'll see you on the next episode of Making Sense of Faith.